questions.
This is Kamilah Sanders, and this is the the fashion industry and its impact. And this is, like we mentioned, it really is the foundation to understand what's going on. And then as you go through the courses, you'll be able to kind of set and understand where you fit in this picture, right? And how you can make an impact. And so, of course, this is part of the first session of the series. And we'll talk about the fashion industry, environmental and social impact. And we'll talk about what's going on now. What are some of the challenges? How do designers play a role within this? And then we'll also talk about how you can particularly make an impact and what are some of the solutions. And just to introduce myself a little bit, I'm sure, afterwards you have access to this. So if you want to read all about me, you can. But briefly, like, I work at the intersection of sustainability, technology, equity, and creativity. I'm founder and CEO of Greater Than Equal. And basically, my background is in marketing and executive leadership. And when I started my own consulting business, I'm like, I want to focus on fashion and sustainability. And that was, something that I'm super passionate about. And I'm also very passionate about people making an impact on the world. So you'll see on this slide, my approach is strategic self-awareness, which means that it's just like, how can you impact the world in a strategic way? How do all of these different things work together? And I just want to check, can you still see my slides? Okay, Britta, it looks like my slides went down. So I'm going to keep going, but maybe, Britta, hopefully you can possibly work on that. But it still says that I'm connected, so I'm not sure what's going on, but I'm going to keep talking. So, so basically, there was some pre-homework. So if you didn't get to do that, that's absolutely fine, because some of the things we'll get to talk about in the show. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to try to share my screen again. I took it off and I'll put it back on. So just let me know if you can see it. So hopefully you can see my screen. But Britta, you might have to add the my computer back in. But anyway, so the homework that we had was basically looking at a fashion documentary or looking at a report. So if you're a person that reads or you want to easily do something as far as like watching something, then this is for you. But we'll talk about some of these things if you didn't get to, because I'm really only saying, choose one thing just so you have some background information. But, and you can always go back to any of these things to go and just get deeper information. So the other homework was researching a little bit about the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which is such an interesting thing, because if you're in the sustainable development, if you're in the sustainability space, like if you say the SDGs, like, people know what you're talking about. But if I say the SDGs to someone, just a normal person, they're probably like, I don't know what you're talking about, right? And so that's why I have one of these, the SDGs, as a goal. But we're going to get into it, that the fashion industry actually impacts many of these SDGs. And we'll get into that in a minute. Now, as I mentioned, this presentation is really for you to get excited and to take action, right? How can you make an impact? And there's so much information in this presentation that you're going to have to like go, you might see something that interests you and like want to do additional research. So that is definitely welcome. And I always, even though, I'm the one that's teaching the workshop, there's going to be stories about other people. And I always think that it's best that those stories are told by the people that it's their story, right? So I cannot specifically speak because I have not lived another person's experience. But what I do is try to do it from that person's actual words, right? And you'll see that. And then, ethics, a lot of times when it comes to sustainable fashion, a lot of people talk about the planet, the planet, the planet, but they don't necessarily talk about the ethics and the social and the people. And so that's why this presentation is so important, because we're going to talk about how that is interjected into the fashion industry. So Global Fashion Agenda, they did a climate report, and they basically said that, hey, the fashion industry is not going in the right direction. We are not going to meet the climate goals. The industry produces anywhere between 4 to 10% of global carbon emissions. Now, no one really knows that exact number. And the reason why they don't necessarily know that exact number is because if you think about the fashion industry, well, there's transportation, right? So there's impact there. We're gonna see where it's impact on like wildlife and water. We're gonna see where it's impacts on um, you know, gender and poverty, because most of the people that are employed by the fashion industry are women. So it's really hard to say what the exact impact is. And so here I have the UN SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. There's 17. And if you think about the fashion industry, most of people say SDG 12, responsible consumption and production. So we produce a lot through fast fashion, and then we consume a lot, especially in the global north. And so that's why that's probably the main SDGs that people do. But then when you start to think about, hey, people along the supply chain, are they making a livable wage? Well, that's number 8, decent work and economic growth. When you think about the impacts on the climate or the water, that's climate action. And number 14, life below water. If you think about what I just mentioned about the fashion industry employs mostly women, you're talking about gender equality, you're talking about no poverty, like there's so many different, and then poverty leads to hunger. And so that's kind of the beauty of the sustainable development goals, is that basically they're saying that if we address all of these, then we can achieve climate goals. So it's not just about the climate, it's also about people and how all these things work together. Okay. So what we're going to do is take a journey along the fashion industry supply chain, right? And so the fashion industry, it is a system, right? And there is a supply chain. If you think about how your jeans are made or how a t-shirt is made. So, a lot of people don't realize or even think about it, but actual people make your clothes. Because if you're thinking about, say, cotton, for example, if you take your cotton shirt, well, there's fiber that has to be produced on a farm. And then from that fiber takes and you make yarn, and then you make fabric, and then you actually go and you produce the garment, right? And then that garment gets sold through a brand and a retailer. And even in that tier 1, that's where designers lie, right? And when you want to impact a system or even the supply chain, you have to think about what is the one place in that supply chain where there's a lot of decisions being made. And if you think about that, the designer makes a lot of decisions, right? Because the designer decides what they're going to make the garment out of. They decide who's going to produce it, who's going to manufacture it. They decide how it's going to go to market, meaning what is the what is the retail channel? Are they doing direct consumer? So there's so many decisions that the designer makes. And so that's why the designer has the power to significantly impact the fashion industry. And so, one of the things that we wanted to cover was conscious fashion design. Like, what is that? And so basically, and this definition is from Inside Fashion Design on their website, but it's basically just thinking about ethical, sustainable, organic, doing things in an ethical and sustainable way, and actually caring like where it comes from. You're caring about people, not just profit, right? And so that's what conscious fashion design is. And there's an article on Inside Fashion Design website, which this links to, and it gives like even more in depth. And it also mentions a book by Ian Peterman about conscious design and some of the pillars for that. So if you're interested in just learning more, you can definitely go to that information. So let's walk along the fashion industry. So first we have the fiber and the yarn. So tier 4, tier 3, right? So we're at the farm, right? And if you think about cotton, the interesting thing about cotton, and this is just an example. And if you're in the industry, you kind of know there's a lot of controversy around cotton as far as like, is it organic or is it not organic? There's so many different things that you can do research on just cotton in general. But I think it's a really good example. I have a quote here: cotton farming in India has become a fashion tragedy. So if you think about, and I'm going to go all the way back to slavery in the United States, they were picking cotton, right? The enslaved peoples were picking cotton. And what were they doing that for? Where they were doing it for the garment industry. And so that's, kind of back in the day, you're thinking like, oh, that was, a long time ago. Is the fashion industry like that now? Well, actually it is, right? Because the cotton still comes from a farm, right? And so India is one of the world's leaders in textile production. And what happens is that the government takes over these farms. They make them use different chemicals. They don't necessarily own their land anymore. And then it's directly linked to, and there's an actual study on this. So if you want to do more research, you definitely can. But it's linked to, yes, the farmers' suicide rate. So in the True Cost, which is like the pillar fashion documentary, they mention that is that they have the highest suicide rate. And it's like, wow, okay. And the reason is because one, the chemicals that you're constantly dealing with on a regular basis, but then also they don't own their land. They can't provide for their family. And so because of this, it's high suicide rates that's directly linked to what's going on in the fashion industry. And so you think about the issues of the past, it's the same thing that is happening right now. And also, the thing is, and I'll go into this a bit, but the fashion industry is a system that was basically built on the backs of low cost, no cost labor, right? And that's kind of how this system works, right? And so we're working to say, hey, how can we do things differently? But let's keep going along the fashion industry supply chain. So we have people that produce the fabric. So let's talk about this. So if you think about denim, and there's a documentary, it's called Blue River, if you really want to get very far into this subject. But basically, or I'm sorry, River Blue is what it's called. But basically, the places which are typically in the global south, those places where they do these chemical manufacturings and they have a lot of chemicals that have to go into like dyeing garments, whether it's denim or it's leather, things like that, where there's waterways. And because of the factories, and this is a picture of it, It's like there's no fish. They can't fish. The kids can't play in the water. So if you think about your own experience with water and at the beach and where you live, where you don't live, or traveling, like that's not their reality, right? There's so much pollution, there's so many chemicals, there's lots of like birth defects and things like that that are in these different areas in the global south, right? With where these different manufacturers go on. And then you also think about, and I'm sure a lot of people have heard about microplastics, right? So when you wash or dry your clothes, these microplastics go into the water. And if you think about, a lot of our garments now are synthetic, they're made out of non-natural materials such as polyester. And because that's basically plastic, that does not degrade. It just goes and it just gets smaller and smaller and smaller into these microplastics, right? And there's definitely an issue within our waters in the ocean where there's these huge like areas that have like microplastics, right? These, in turn, the fish eat plastics, and then the fish go on our plate and we eat them, right? So if you can imagine, and even, recently they're talking about, hey, we found microplastics in placenta or in the air that we breathe. Like there's just so much that it's impacting us and it's impacting our health. And I like to use this example sometimes. I do have friends that shop at like Shein and other and other things, and they get like these pleather plastic outfits. It's super cute, yes, but they get it out the package and they're like, oh my gosh, this smells so bad. But they still wear it, right? And so you really have to think about your health as an individual, but health in general, right? And so there is a book called To Die For. And yes, yikes. But there is a book called To Die For if you want to get into like more into like the chemicals that are used in fashion and how just how it impacts and some of the different cases that go on with that, because it does impact people, and people do get sick and have gotten sick um, based off of this chemical process. But let's keep going down the fashion industry supply chain. And let's talk about people that produce garments, right? And so this is kind of what I was talking about, right? Is that the fashion industry was built on low, no cost labor, right? And so now people don't realize, like I said, but people actually make our clothes, right? And so there's places in the global south I mentioned, like Bangladesh, India, China, of course, even in the United States, New York, Los Angeles, there are factories that have not so great conditions. And so we're going to go into the actual labor part of it. And if you're familiar with the organization Remake, they have said that garment, we call them garment worker, it really should be garment maker. That's why I had this in quotes, garment worker in quotes, because it's kind of like, oh, they're a worker. Versus if you're a designer, you would never, and you sew clothes, you would never want to be called a worker. You, if you're an artisan, right? And so, why do we call garment workers? You're kind of dehumanizing it and not really recognizing the craft that they actually have. But it is said that they make the equivalent of like $2 an hour, right? So can you imagine working all day for $2 an hour? I cannot imagine it. But basically, Fashion Revolution is another organization where you can find a lot of information, but they kind of got started because in 2013 there was a fire in a garment worker factory in Bangladesh. It was called Rana Plaza, and a lot of people passed during that. And part of the reason is because the infrastructure of the building, they couldn't necessarily afford to pay for the infrastructure of the building, or they didn't do anything different with that. We'll go into some of the conditions, but sometimes like they lock the doors, they have to meet these high demands. And the issue with that, because a lot of times you say, oh, there should be more government regulation in those countries. There should be more, the manufacturers, it's really their issue. But a lot of times what happens, and if I don't know if you're familiar, and I'm going to say it, like Walmart is kind of like the price leader. And if Walmart says, you're going to sell us, you're going to give me this particular thing at this price, you're kind of like, okay, because you're going to buy a lot. And so like these manufacturers are kind of competing against price, and they want to win the business of this big brand. And so if a big brand says, hey, I have this large order, I only want to pay you $1 a piece, then they're going to say, okay, yes, because I don't want you to go to my competition. People here really need the jobs, that type of thing. And so it kind of just leads to them having less than ideal conditions because they are in that scarcity mindset where they're like, we have to take what we're given. And so I mentioned that the majority of people in the fashion industry that are employed in the fashion industry are women. And so this is a story of Nazreen, and she is one of the links that I did for the pre-work. She actually says it's a video. It's a short video. I think it's less than 10 minutes. But she talks about her story, right, and how she made it out of this type of condition, right? And if you think about it, you think about the system of, poverty. People that are garment makers, they don't necessarily make a living wage. Maybe they're making like $2 an hour. They travel long ways to get to the factory. They go home, they barely can put food on the table. And it's almost like it is like a cycle of how do they get out of this condition. They have to work, but what they're working, it's not enough. They're not getting paid enough. And so what do, right? And it's a cycle, it's a system, right? And so, she talks about how they'd have to be, so an order would be 500 pieces a week. They start at 4 o'clock in the morning and work until 10, and it would still not be finished, right? They had to sleep on a pile of clothes. So this is her experience. And it's just inhumane, right? They wouldn't let them use the bathroom, things like that. So if you look at her story, I encourage you to watch that video. And there's actually other videos on Remake's website too, but think about it from that perspective of what actually happens, from the garment maker's perspective. So one thing that I also wanted to touch on too in this is cultural appropriation versus appreciation. And because a lot of times people are like, okay, what is this? What is the difference? When can we use, specific things from different cultures? So it's basically like cultural appropriation is not adopting another culture, or maybe it's like their fabric or their methods and the ways that they do things, their ideas, but you don't necessarily acknowledge that. So we see that a lot in the fashion industry, even with smaller designers, and these larger brands or designers just kind of like take their design, and now they're making millions of dollars off this design from a smaller designer, when it's like, whoa, that's not cool, because that designer could be making that money versus this larger brand. And so this happens a lot with larger brands, and anyone really. And so you want to be mindful when you're doing designs. It's okay to appreciate different cultures, but ask yourself the question, like, are you appropriating, are you taking this as your own, or are you helping to expand and tell other people's stories? So cultural appreciation is when you are really want to learn about this culture and you want to celebrate a culture, and you're telling and you're including them in this process and in the story of where this particular thing came from. So there's absolutely nothing wrong with us sharing cultures and doing things together and working together, but the erasure is what is typically wrong. So I want to address that. So what is the solution? Of course, you know, learn about the different cultures. If you're, working with different, fabrics or different methods and things like that, take a learn for that. Also, hire, consult with people from that culture, and then also make sure that when you're telling the story of what you're doing, make sure that you're also mentioning that culture and that story too. And so this is a story about, I won't get into it that much, but it's, if you want to read about it, it is that, but it is talking about, and this is from Remake, and it is talking about like a story of a garment maker that is very impactful, but it tells that story, and it calls for action toward H&M regarding this. So you can read on that, but I won't go into it too much because it is triggering, but I won't go into it too much, but you can definitely read more about that. So now we're talking about brands and retailers. So going to the final step in the fashion industry supply chain, right? And so just that there is a part for brands to play. And what this climate report says is that there is a part to play. So a lot of it does have to do with manufacturing, but there's a part to play with brands. And there's also a part to play with your own everyday citizen behaviors, right? Which is largely impacted by these brands, right? And so there is a role to play with this. So one of the things that I want to talk about when it comes to this is that a lot of the clothes that are manufactured in the global north, even the clothes that are purchased, they are given to secondhand clothing places. So you think about like the Goodwill or wherever else, even stores that don't necessarily sell all their clothes for those seasons, they're kind of shipped off. Or if you think about everyday people, or you think about on YouTube, and there's people doing these clothing hauls where they got all of this clothing from a store, they can't possibly wear it. If you've ever had a past in where you shopped in like a H&M or something like that, and you're like, oh, this doesn't really fit great, I don't even like this, I kind of just bought this because it was cheap and I really wanted to feel good about myself that day. I'm sure people don't say that, but if you think about it, that's somewhat what happens, because since it's so cheap, you're just like, okay, I need that quick hit of dopamine. But a lot of stuff like you don't even wear because it doesn't fit, or you washed it and it doesn't, it didn't hold up. And so a lot of the clothes that Americans, so this is an example for the global north, consume, which is 3.8 billion annually, is sent to landfills, right? And what happens is that a lot of these clothes, and if you look to the right, there is on the top, there's like a market, right, in Ghana. And on the bottom, you'll see these bales, they call them bales, and it's all these secondhand clothes, right? And they ship them to the global south. So, for example, the Guantanamo market in Ghana, and they purchase these bales of clothing, of secondhand clothing. They have no idea what's going to come in there. So some of the clothing they can't even sell, but they take these clothes and they bring them to the market to sell to people in their country. Now, if you think about, if they can't use these clothes or they don't sell them, those are going to go into the landfill, but it's not going back to the landfill in the global north. It's going to the landfill in the global south. And if you can imagine that level of pollution, right, that happens within the global south, and the because the global north is over consuming and overproducing, but it's impacting the global south, which is not necessarily in a way, like, it's not necessarily fair, right? because they are not the ones that are doing the overconsumption and the overproduction. And I also host a podcast called Fashion Futurist. So if you want to learn more about this and kind of the perspective from people in, Africa, or have been impacted, and talked to people, that is a good podcast to kind of listen to, because to me, you'll kind of be shocked at the view of it, because um, if you think about the clothing, and they're selling all these secondhand clothing from the global north, what happens to the economy there when you have designers and local designers that produce quality clothing but at higher prices, right? But then you have the market where you can actually get clothes that are super cheap. And so what happens there? And then you're also thinking about, well, this actually provides a living for some people. And so again, we're talking about systems. Like, this is a system that you have to work to do something different. And so there's a lot more insight into that, but this is actually from a website called deadmansclothes.org, so you can go there and you can research all about that too. And then just another thing is that, we talked about, and I just want to, shed this, is that a lot of times people talk about, oh, we're getting these clothes and they're going to landfills, but a lot of the waste is actually done through the clothing manufacturers or the brands, because the high-end brands or luxury brands, they would rather go and burn their clothes than to have their clothes discounted, right? Because it makes it seem like the clothes are less value, because they have all these clothes that did not sell and now they have to discount it, right? And so there's definitely been a lot of different instances where their clothes, they just burn them. They just get rid of them, right? And that's how they get rid of them, rather than them ending up in a store that is discounted. So this is a huge way that the fashion industry has waste, is through the brands too. So uh, if you have any questions, I'm going to take a breather. Everyone take a breather, because that was a lot. But yes, definitely should be illegal. And so, take a breather, because now we're going to talk about what are some of the solutions. And Britta, I see you right there.
Yeah, just popping in for a second. Do you want to take a 5-minute break and you guys run to refill your drink or go to the restroom? We can certainly do that. How are you guys feeling? Anyone need a break? Camilla need a break?
I'm good.
You're good. Okay, let's
I'm
keep
good.
going. Everyone good?
Okay.
Okay. Rock on.
Awesome. So I love it that you say, like, this should be legal, like illegal, like we should do something about this. Now, keep in mind, we're also talking about a system that works a certain way. And so there's a lot of different things that, even if you try to do some things, it's still going to work like that system, right? It's kind of like, I just thinking of this analogy like a clock. You can change the time on the clock, but it still works the same in the background, right? And so there's only like so much that you can do. Exactly. And so what can you do to either impact the system so that it starts to gradually change into something different and starts to gradually get better, or work outside of that system and create something new? And so, for example, wouldn't it be great if, instead of purchasing from these fast fashion brands, we only purchase from smaller designers, right? And we're kind of working outside of that. And so, we talk about like the climate goals and things like that. 2030 is not that far away. Like, I hate thinking about it, but I'm like, oh my gosh, that's not far away. And we're already seeing the impacts of climate, right? We're seeing it getting hotter. We're seeing all these weather events, and, these new types of, tornadoes or storms, and, all this stuff. So we're seeing what's happening. We're seeing people, migrating to different countries, and seeing famine and things like that. And so the it's being impacted now. So it's like, gosh, do we really have time for the system to go so slow toward what's next. So that's where you come in, right? So what this is from Remake. It's a fashion accountability report. And basically, and you can read the full report. The link is in there. But basically, it goes through and it says, based on these different factors, here's where the brands stand up. So talk about traceability, meaning that you actually know what's going on in your supply chain, which is what we just talked about, which a lot of these larger brands, they can only tell you that, hey, we just have these designs and we ship them out to be manufactured. We don't even really know where they get manufactured. Like, that's what they would tell you, right? And so they can't track their supply chain. But with smaller brands, and especially a brand coming up now, you have a lot of decisions that you can make and be sustainable. And it's not necessarily that much higher of a cost, just not being sustainable. And I say that based on the sustainable brands that I know, that now that there's so much awareness and solutions out there, you have more of a choice and you can actually track your supply chain a lot better than these larger companies. So if you're thinking about kind of a point for your customers and to talk to them and say, hey, this is exactly the process that these clothes go through, and you can probably do that a lot more than these larger brands. So they also rate on wages and well-being, commercial practices, raw materials, environmental justice, and governance. And it just has a list of these companies, but then it also talks about how things have progressed over last year, which maybe environmental justice and raw materials have gotten better, but nothing else has really gotten better as far as like the traceability, wages, the different practices, and governance, right? We're only just now starting to see the government paying attention to what's going on in the fashion industry and attempting to regulate it, right? And even although there has been a little bit of improvement, all of these companies on average score pretty low in all these areas. But if you wanted to get deeper, you can do that. So, okay, if you're thinking about working in the system, right? And so I put this here. I said it's important to recognize that large companies are working within the system, a system built on the oppression of Black and brown people on low, no-cost wages. So that is what the system is, right? And it's no so what can you do if you are working for a fashion company, or you're talking to someone that kind of works in that system? And like I said, there's some brands that have a lot better practices than others, but basically Remake also says share your profits, right? So you're making millions of dollars, but you're not really passing that down to the garment maker. And a big thing is empathy, right? Because studies show that if you're in this kind of bubble, in a sense, then you operate within that bubble. You don't necessarily have empathy for people that are so far removed, right? And so how do we build empathy, right? How do we, within these corporations, how do we touch that person that's at that high level that doesn't necessarily have that empathy? Well, a lot of companies now are making sure that they have a diverse workforce, and that they also have people in leadership that can make decisions from a more empathetic lens. Because if you think about someone that is a female, or someone that is, a Black and brown person, they are not as far removed from some of these things that may not necessarily happen. Like, it's not that they, have someone that they know that's a garment maker, but they may have someone that they know that doesn't make, doesn't make a living wage. Like, it's closer to that person, and it adds more diversity, and it actually helps to, there's definitely studies that show that the more diverse your company is, the more, creative things that you're going to think of, the better you're going to do in the market, the more innovative you're going to be. And so that is part of what these different corporations can do, is to make sure that they're hiring for diversity. And so this is kind of that stat that I was talking about, is that companies, according to McKinsey, that if they're diverse, then they're going to pass their peers, right? And so this is kind of a famous illustration, but it talks about equity, where you're giving people all the same. So equality, where you're giving people all the same. Equity is where you're, giving people that need it a little bit extra. Reality, but then also liberation is like kind of like, why do we even have a fence in the first place? So I love this illustration because it's like, wait, why do we even have this barrier for people to be included? Like, how do we break down these barriers, not just give people a leg up, but start to, expand our mind and break down barriers at all, right? And so that's, I think, really where we were trying to go to. So what can you do as a brand or as an individual citizen? So, one, you can ask questions. You can understand your supply chain as a brand owner, these different decisions that you make. Um, get with the sustainable, ethical community, see who else is using these different technologies or different manufacturers. Start to talk to people, get in that community, and understand like your own decisions and what that is tracking to. So, for example, there's a local sustainable brand here, and I can ask him like, what farm, where'd you source this from? And they can tell me the entire, like, where was this made? They can tell me their entire supply chain, right? And so I think that's pretty amazing that these sustainable ethical designers have, know that information. And you do have to do your due diligence as far as like manufacturing, visiting the place, working with people that have visited the place, hire a consultant if you can do that. And one of the things that I want to talk about is technology. So, and I say like blockchain technology, not sure if you're familiar or not, but this is something that is happening within the fashion industry where if you scan a QR code or whatever, you can scan that and the customer can know, oh, okay, this is where it was made, this is how much the garment worker was paid, those types of things. And you can also just track. So basically, I'll say the blockchain is basically a record, right? It's like your transactions, a record of your transactions. And it's something that cannot be changed, or it's very hard to change or fake it, right? And so it's just a more secure technology that can communicate digitally. So here they have, Providence has an app where they're saying, okay, because of these different transactions happen, like say, for example, you got it from this manufacturer or that has, sustainable ethical practices. You had this transaction from the farm that, sold the cotton, like things like that. They can actually trace and say what happened in the supply chain on a digital level, right? That is immutable, is what they say. So basically that means that it's secure, like the information is most likely correct, right? And so that's just, in summary, that's some ways to do it, but there's so many different ways and so much new technology that's coming out that will help you to not only know your supply chain, but also tell your story. So I know a lot of people that have brands, they struggle to tell that sustainable ethical story, right? But there's artificial intelligence and things like that that you can work through to really get your message out there. And then also for citizens, everyday citizens, maybe you are or are not a designer, then things that you can do is like, some of the organizations that we talked about, we talked about Fashion Revolution, like some of those organizations, you can be a part of those organizations and join a group of people that have regular conversation around this. Another thing that you can absolutely do is you can vote, right? A lot of people, they don't necessarily think about what they can do just as an everyday citizen. And what you can do is that you have the power to choose people that are going to make good decisions when it comes to people and planet, right? And so, one of the most powerful things that you can do as an individual is vote. Um, and I'm going to reshare my screen. We have like a few more slides. So hold on a sec. And of course, one thing that I say too, like we packed in so much information into this presentation. Like, do research. Of course, there's so many documentaries out there. And I think the number one thing that you can do actually is to wear your values, which means that if you're, a lot of times in the sustainability space, we tell people like, oh, you shouldn't buy from H&M, you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that. And we're kind of talking at people and not really making people feel welcome. But one of the things that you can do as an individual is, find a sustainable designer and wear that. Go to thrift shopping and wear that. Don't be afraid to wear like a dress again to an event. And if people call you out on it, say, hey, yes, I'm doing this because I'm being sustainable, right? Or I'm doing this, I'm wearing this designer. Oh, you like this, dress or this top? Well, it's from this designer. They do this, they have sustainable practices, they pay the people that make the garments this much. Like, that's your opportunity to actually set an example. And I think that that's the biggest way, because everyone has their sphere of influence, whether it's your immediate family or it's your entire social media following. Like, you have a sphere of influence, right? And so I want to go into a few resources too. So we talked about like the different documentary, which is, True Cost is like the documentary to watch. So if you haven't seen it, definitely watch it. And we talked about like River Blue. I mean, there's so many different documentaries out there about sustainable fashion. And there's courses out there, of course. This particular course, there's information on Fashion Revolution that you can also, take courses, education on that. And then I also have a link to the SDGs for fashion. And some of the organizations, another organization that I really love is Fashion Takes Action. If you go on their website, they have a bunch of different webinars and things like that that really talk about a lot of this. Some of them I hosted, so look out for that. But there's so many different organizations: Clean Clothes Campaign, Ethical Fashion Initiative. There's lots of organizations that you can research, but then also get involved with. And so that is pretty much the course. And just, I'm going to open it up for any discussion. I believe that if we have time, but, tell me, like, what do you think about what we went over? What were some of the like aha things that happened? I mean, we talked about what was going on in the fashion industry, and we talked about some of the solutions. Like, where do you think that you can fit in this? Like, I'd love to get some feedback.
I'm curious what, for example, like Shonda does in the industry. If you're a designer or just a fashion enthusiast, because I think that kind of, you can be working in the industry or just a fan and a citizen, a regular customer, and you can make a difference in different ways. So depending on kind of what your role is, I'm curious how you would use your position to make a difference in some manner.
Are you saying me personally, or are you saying just
no, like
in
Shonda
particular?
or some of the attendees? Like, if you're listening or you're a participant in this course, thinking about, are you are you a consumer, a customer of a brand, and you're a fashion enthusiast looking to learn more? Are you in the industry? And if you are in your position, what could you do within like your process?
Yeah. Okay. So
It?
that's a question for the attendees. Okay. Awesome.
Shonda.
Okay. So here's the thing that, okay, you're gonna, oh, okay, she can come to the stage.
Yeah, look at that.
Oh, you're putting up the, okay.
Perfect.
So,
Yeah. So
the interesting thing is that, like, a lot of times I tell individual people, like, what you can do is shop with local designers. And they're like, well, what if they're not sustainable, this and that? But I said, a local designer it's not mass producing clothing, right? So if anything, they are supporting them is going to help build this new innovative future, and it's not necessarily supporting people that are mass producing. So I'm going to be honest with you and be realistic. Like, I'd rather someone support a local designer than support, some of these like larger brands. And as a designer, the fashion industry is not perfect. Like, I've talked to designers and they're like, I try to be, sustainable and ethical. You cannot be 100% sustainable. So don't think it's a game of like perfection, because there's going to be something like the global fashion industry. When you source stuff, you're probably going to have to source internationally, right? And so it's going to be hard to be 100%. But like you said, you make choices. So I see Chandra, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, then you have to put 2 handmade collections made 100% from donated materials and dead stock. So love that. I work with materials in small batches and work with local fabric dyers. So local, you work locally, that's always amazing. Like, I do not plan on sourcing internationally. So making those decisions to say, hey, I'm not going to do this particular thing. I'm going to figure out who can I work with on a local basis. I'm going to figure out like what materials I can source on a local basis. I'm going to figure out how to really be bespoke and only work and custom things and do. So making those decisions and actually sticking to those decisions and doing those decisions, I think that that's super important.
I'll mention another film, Fashion Reimagined, which is
Oh,
more
yeah.
recent, and it shows the struggle of the designer who is trying to be completely sustainable from the seed and the soil to the end product and end of life. And you just, when you watch it, like, I'm a designer by trade, and I'm watching that and I just feel her pain.
Yeah.
She's traveling all over just to find the source. And even with a sustainable produced yarn, the yarn producers aren't sure where all the wool is coming from, because it's coming from, multiple different wool suppliers. So they can't necessarily, they can say their practices are sustainable and maybe they're spinning, they're using steam and different eco-friendly practices, but they can't prove where the wool is coming from. And so the designer, just struggles to find answers to all these things. And it's so challenging. It's so difficult. And so you just kind of watch that and feel her pain. And so as a designer,
Yeah.
I think, like you said, it's, do what you can within your, your world, your access to resource, it all helps, even if it's just a little bit, like, do what you can, and hopefully it, has a domino effect and everyone else will do the same, and collectively it'll start to shift the needle.
Yeah. Absolutely. And that's why, and I'm glad we have some sessions that are going to talk a little bit about technology and expose people to technology, because there is a company out there that is looking at just that. It's like, from the farm, where are these fibers coming from? And how do we say that this fiber is sustainable and ethically created? Where is it coming from? And so they have, like I mentioned, like that blockchain technology that will actually say like, hey, this is from here. And then you also have to go back and you have to do spot checks to make sure that it's actually true. But, hopefully we can start to do some innovative things where it's not as difficult for the designer to make these choices.
Yeah, that's a great point. So we have several sessions coming up between now and December. We've mapped out an entire process, basically, and we are covering some business fundamentals, as well as, like you mentioned, the AI. We have 2 sessions on AI. One is more focused on pattern making and fitting and efficiencies in pattern making and production. And then the other AI tool is, research and trends. And so everything's just more efficient, and you're wasting less time, you're wasting less money, less fabric by using some of these AI tools. So we're going to have some sessions on that, as well as one thing I think is super important to me, at least, to call out is, think about where you are in your life right now, with your career, with personal and professional life, and where do you want to get to? And so kind of mapping out your North Star and figuring out, what do you want to achieve? What do you want to gain from attending these sessions? And so thinking about that now at the beginning. And then we have sessions that support that, like writing a manifesto, looking at your values. Mental health is super important to me too, because I think that was often missed I think it's becoming more common now and more acceptable now to address those things. But 20 years ago, 10 years ago, it's like you just powered through and nobody really cared about your mental health. You're just working at a corporate level or maybe a small designer where you just go, 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 go all the time and you're not taking care of yourself. So I feel it's also really important to consider that aspect of your work, because it affects everything. It affects how you go through your day and your energy level, meeting with other people. So we have multiple sessions on all of these different topics that really work cohesively together. And I do feel too that everything is interconnected. And if you look at the big picture of the design process and development process as a whole, you have to go through these different phases and not to ignore, certain things, but making sure it's all working together. So I'm super excited about the upcoming sessions too. And you actually have a second session way towards the end.
Yes.
Which will pull everything together too. So you can mention that really quick and then see if there's any other questions we have.
Yeah. So the session is on strategy, right? And it's like, how do you take all this information that you learned from the courses and put that together into an action plan where you can go forth and make an impact, but actually not necessarily feel lost with all this information, but have something that you can follow. And also the homework for this session is what you mentioned is, now that you have this information, and I know like there's certain things that you do within your design practice that you are very specific, like this is who I am, these are my values, this is what I'm going to do. And so I challenge you to write down a personal value statement or a manifesto that basically says like, what is your stance on sustainability and ethics in fashion? What are the things that you are going to do going forward? What are the values that you have? What is what you believe and that you want to hold true throughout this course, but throughout your life, right? And so, take some time to write a few, sentences, or, if you want to go long, you can write paragraphs, but I think that that's going to help you kind of set the foundation and the groundwork for going forward, how you reflect on these different courses that are coming up and your life, everyday life.
Yeah, and that's a perfect segue for Thursday's session, which is aligning personal values with conscious fashion design. So it leads perfectly into that. And part of the homework is a design values assessment and also a character strength survey, which I think will be super interesting. So you will find those in the, when you go back to your program and look at session 2, those links will be in there. The surveys are in there. So you can do that all ahead of time before the course. So you kind of have a list in mind already. So are there any other questions we have today for Kamilah? And I'll mention too that we can continue this conversation after. You can make comments and ask questions. This isn't just a hard stop of a topic and conversation. This is going to be ongoing throughout the entire process. And we want to engage with you and learn from each other and be there to answer more questions that come up. So don't feel like this is, you're done with this session and that's it. We're going to continue growing and learning together, and questions are always welcome. And we want to connect on a more personal level. So definitely let us know what you need. If you have other questions, don't hesitate to reach out at all. So with that,
well, I do. I see Julie has a comment that she made about designing with circularity in mind.
Yeah.
And so we talked about how, designers have all these different choices that they make and how they impact the fashion industry supply chain. So this is such a great point, because when you design with circularity in mind, you're figuring out and thinking about what is the end life of this garment, right? And so sometimes designers will say, hey, how can I make this garment adjust? If you're making kids clothes, how can I make it adjust with the child growing, right? So it can last longer. How can I make it out of more sustainable materials so that people will have it longer? And then once they have it, what happens at the end of the life of that
End of life.
garment? Can
Yep.
they recycle it? Can you repurpose it into something else? Can you do some type of program where people can give it back to you and you make it into a pillow? Like, I'm
Yeah.
just
Buyback
using that
program.
as an example, but I mean,
Yeah.
absolutely, like that is part of circular designing with the end in mind. So I think that was a wonderful point that I wanted to acknowledge.
Yeah. And consumers are demanding that.
Yeah.
So if your brand is sharing that story and not greenwashing, have actual proof that they're designing and developing product with circularity and an end in mind, you can see, Patagonia is a perfect example, is you can completely see the transparency chain of what they're doing and how they buy back or they repair, reuse. So I feel like if you can build that into your own brand, whether it's your own designer or the company you're working for, I feel like that's setting you up for success in the future, because I feel like if you're not one of those brands, you're going to eventually fade away.
Yeah, and I love this idea of building collections that can build up on each other, right? And so you have a piece, but then the next collection you can actually wear those pieces with the past collection, so you're not necessarily
Yeah.
like you're not doing the fast fashion system, which is like, oh, here's something new. You got to get something new, different, new, new, new. Like, how does this all work together in like functional, this brings me back to what you were saying, like mental health.
Yeah.
Because if I supported a designer where, oh, next season, like I love this designer, I can support, I'm getting something new, but it also matches the stuff that I just bought. Like, there's so
Yeah.
much
You build
sanity.
upon it. Yeah.
Right.
That would make our lives so much easier.
It
Even if the
would.
materials were similar or go together, you can layer
Mhm.
things. You just kind of add in a couple pieces, each season or when you need a new
Yeah.
jacket or something, and it all works with what you already have. And
Yeah.
that's brilliant. Like it sounds so simple. It's such a simple thing. But yet it's hard to find. So yeah.
Yeah, it's that's what happens when you start to think like outside of that fast fashion mindset, and you start to think of with the end in mind. Like if that's your goal, then you're going to start thinking toward what are some solutions toward that goal. So love it.
Yeah, yeah, that makes me think. One more comment is our session on Thursday is being taught by Daniela Kane, who she's a certified breath work coach and trauma informed. She's combined that with her experience as a designer. She's worked for big name companies. She's been in charge of big design teams at major brands, and she also started her own line called Corey Faye, and she uses all hand woven linen from India, which she calls, and it has high vibrational clothing, because they actually measured. I don't know how you measure, but there's some sort of measurement tool of the energy and the vibration of this handmade, hand woven linen. And when you wear it, it actually elevates the energy level. It's amazing. And so that's her main fabric, and she uses it for all her pieces. She does some solid, a couple of different colors, then she's doing a couple prints, but it's all the same fabric. So every time you buy a piece, it does go with the previous. You can update one button down blouse with a new color maybe in one season. But she just
Wow.
continually uses that amazing fabric, and you build upon that, and it creates an amazing high vibrational wardrobe. So she will share with that, I'm sure, on Thursday as well. And it's fantastic to know that there are designers out there that are really making these big kind of shifts and offering a new way to do things.
Love it.
So thank you all for being here. And Kamilah, thank you. And if there's no more questions, I think we can call it a wrap for today. And I look forward to seeing everyone on the next